So for those who don't know me, I'm a postdoctoral researcher and an environmental lawyer by training and also by practice, let's say. So I could say my real motivation to enter this subject was really to feel with my own and witness with my own eyes the sense of like not being able to do anything that many communities experience while being exposed to environmental wrongdoings, environmental stressors. And I had the impression that citizen sensing was a way to creatively and meaningfully engage with environmental information and based on this information to develop claims. So I'm personally a very curious person, and I think citizen sensing draws on curiosity of people that are exposed to a stressor and start thinking what they can actually do to respond to that. And I'm also a person that is very energetic, as you may have seen if you know me. And I think citizen sensing somehow crowdsource the energy of the collectives, so of communities that are day by day experiencing an environmental problem. And this energy becomes knowledge, and the knowledge becomes arguments, and eventually the arguments can become policy decision and even legal intervention. So I'm coming from practice. Before entering academia, I focused on 2 cases of environmental contamination. One was in Chile related to mining, and one in Ecuador related to oil extraction. And in both cases, I witnessed this sense of nothing to do and isolation that the community experienced. And later on, I decided to look into the intersection between law, technology, and society during my PhD. And I was particularly, let's say, fascinated by how risk information trigger people into action. And so I developed 4 years research, a little bit less, that then entered, let's say, into the domain of the policy uptake of citizen sensing. And then after the PhD, I kind of found that there was a piece of information missing in all this frame, which was really about the judicial uptake of citizen sensing data. So citizen gather data and evidence of environmental contamination. And I tried to focus on this aspect. And now with the Sensing for Justice project, and I will share the link in the chat, together with Sven Schade at the European Commission Joint Research Center, we are looking at how citizen-generated data can be used both as a source of evidence in environmental litigation and as a tool to eventually mediate the environmental conflict, as we know that the justice system is not always and often not timely to respond to the demands of those needing environmental justice. And lastly, together with Muki as well, that I see in this call, we are exploring this innovative idea of a right to contribute to environmental information, which becomes very timely in contexts that are very extreme, like after a nuclear disaster, or, for example, after in contexts such as risky, such as Basilicata, if you think to our own European scenario, or Latin America, or Africa, and so on.
Many years ago, I had the opportunity to witness a community in the Ecuadorian Amazon who was exposed to an environmental distress, a massive oil contamination. But the community didn't stay steady watching their land destroyed. Over the time, they kept monitoring with drones the oil contamination across the rainforest. I got inspired by them because they were constantly watching over as civic sentries their own environment. So I'm a true believer in the power of an active citizenship for the management of environmental issues. So I decided to engage in a research to wonder how citizen sensing can actually impact and be integrated into institutional risk governance.
This image for me captures what is citizen sensing, that is driven by need, is driven by curiosity, and is driven by an inherent need of people to access environmental information. So many people don't know really the term, and I often, when I debate with people, I try to give examples. So basically, every one of us in one moment in their lives have probably experienced something similar to being a civic sentinel. Basically, being exposed to an environmental problem on which you want to find out more and use your own skills to investigate these, which can be your smell, your sight, and many other, and eventually also more sophisticated light sensor, to find some truths. I decided, as the landscape could be potentially too broad, to focus on 4 key elements. So one was this idea that it comes from below, it comes from the grassroots. So it's not a citizen initiative, let's say a citizen science initiative that is more, let's say, channeled by an institution. But I looked at these initiatives that were really coming from the ground. Second, I looked at these initiatives that were responding to some form of risk, such as nuclear risk. And then I looked at how people try to find out information that sometimes are true, sometimes are debatable, because of distrust. So they feel that they cannot trust the mainstream official or company information. And this combination of elements also, let's say, interplay with the technology elements as the sensor becomes an important aspect, because I looked at these initiatives that were actually using some forms of technology to measure. And that was a clear choice. In fact, in the Census project, I'm not making the same choice and looking at also, for example, only smell or only sight censoring, let's say. But this was quite important as a sort of selection lens. And then, of course, the power of the crowd, but applied to 2 specific initiatives. So I looked at the Safecast nuclear, so the Safecast initiative that is essentially our response to the massive nuclear disaster, Fukushima of 2011. And it's quite important to say this now, because just yesterday, there was the 10 years anniversary of the Safecast initiative, and it was a wonderful day when the Safecast volunteers drove around Fukushima and showed the sensor that they still have there. And the initiative 10 years after is even more lively than then. And I think it shows also important lessons in terms of sustainability of the initiative over time. The idea overall in studying the Safecast initiative and another more Dutch-oriented case of air quality monitoring, where clearly the risks were quite different, so also useful as comparison, was to wonder actually which factors contribute to the policy uptake of citizen sensing. And I tried to combine this more, let's say, causal flow with a more creative contribution to the field, which was really drawing an integrative framework for having citizen sensing structurally complement institutional risk governance. And I will highlight that there is a critical juncture, so exactly this red dot, where the integration becomes possible and also desirable. And I want to stress that because I also didn't advocate for integration at any cost, but only under selected conditions. And in fact, I, based on both the qualitative data analysis that I illustrate to you, that was also strengthened by a field visit to Fukushima and to Japan, which allowed me also to come closer to the research field, was complemented also by a more, let's say, quantitative analysis on a larger data set that was compiled by the Joint Research Center on Citizen Science for Policy. And based on the combined analysis of qualitative data and of quantitative data, especially using a sort of mixed method approach and the fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis methods that I wish you to know more, but I cannot really elaborate on these now, but definitely go for the study to know more. I basically realized that the key elements for a successful integration of citizen sensing into risk policy making was, of course, the importance of data quality, the engagement of governmental actors from the initiative begin. So try to dialogue with governmental actors while maintaining a critical mass. And this is also important for this trade-off between integration and independence. I also discovered that, for example, an initiative that shows this trust seems actually to be appealing for policymakers, so that policymakers are kind of stimulated by this distrust discourse. And this was quite interesting. And maybe governmental failures are pinpointed to push governments to do better and over time to make distrust become trust. And lastly, the risk was really important, as it was not only the main trigger, but also an occasion to show governmental failures and an actual need for citizen sensing initiatives, because sometimes we also tend to forget that some citizen sensing initiatives come out of need and are not, let's say, a side passion of some amateurs. So that, let's say, this recipe was quite important for me to then dive into what I could call an integrative framework that provides for, and I won't go too much in detail here, but really provides for two scenarios. One of those initiatives that really strive for being integrated in the system, so that wants policy at stake, and those initiatives that instead don't want to be integrated, and rather for this kind of initiative, we should find a way to still have them contributing to policymaking, but just another way. And therefore, mediation becomes particularly important for these initiatives that don't want to find the dialogue with the governmental actors. And again, I stress that uptake doesn't mean one fits all. So there are various levels of uptake that can mirror the needs of an initiative. And lastly, I think, let's say, an important thing that I discovered, like an avenue that I discovered during my research, is that there is a long way ahead, especially because we lack lawyers in this field. And so in drawing a possible regulatory framework for integrating citizen science into risk governance, I really realized that the lawyers out there should start mobilize and support my efforts, because the way is really long and we need environmental lawyers, we need policymakers, we need environmental scientists to really come up with a sustainable solution to integrate, let's say, sustainably and healthy citizen sensing into risk governance. So with this, I would like to invite, let's say, the lawyers that are listening to really step up and join. Also because we have, let's say, there's many more, likely this research really triggered more interest in the field. And also, let's say, I'm seeing environmental lawyers turning to this domain with growing interest. So there's a new field to discover and the synergies are many. And so join our debate. Thank you for this question, and I think it's a massive question, but I will keep it brief. I think one of the key finding of this ongoing study is that there's no way you can voice environmental justice claim if you don't have evidence. And there are two ways to gather this evidence. So one is to build on existing expert or governmental findings. And for example, we are seeing the climate litigation around the world are basically basing themselves mostly on, let's say, expert findings, which is something that is not necessarily bad, which is actually the way has been done so far. The problem is when the people concerned don't really trust this mainstream information, or when this information, let's say, doesn't meet the expectation of these people, because, for example, the problem is just hasn't been spotted by the institution. And in this case, basically, citizen sensing becomes a way to fill monitorial gaps that can then inform environmental justice claims in a way that is grounded and is not just, let's say, screaming in the squares, which is also needed, or media attention is also needed, but it's really showing to the other party, which can be a court, can be a governmental actor, that their citizens are ready to meaningfully commit to gather this information. And this is something that I think it's a step ahead compared to, let's say, just screaming in a square or going to the media and scream again. So it's really a meaningful way to engage with a problem, gather information, confront with other, let's say, lay experts, so experts by experience, even with scientific experts, because most of the citizen science initiative we discuss are also teaming up with experts. The point is that you don't start from the official information out there, you start from the concern of the community and you go out there to find evidence. And I want to stress it's particularly valuable for me when the official evidence, let's say, is not sufficiently or not at all covered. Because when there is good science about a problem, I think the citizen centuries there could just complement. But when it's just not there, then we have an environmental justice problem if this is something the community struggle with. This is also an important aspect, and I would say one is that is particularly also close to my current curiosity, because for two main reasons. One, because increasingly we see the environmental justice domain engaging also with discussion on social movements, resistance, activism from the ground. And so I think, let's say, the domain, the scientific domain of environmental justice is very interlinked with that of activism and also data activism. Second, because let's say we had the opportunity with Sven Schade, Yasuhito Abe, and then on a book on COVID from the Margin to explore this theme from two different dimensions, one on, let's say, the legitimization of citizen-generated data, the other more on resistance to COVID misinformation. And in both cases, civic monitoring became basically a way to voice resistance in a way that was understandable from the other side and credible. And I think this is particularly valuable as we see many forms of activism that often falls short in science, whereas citizen sensing is a way to be activist while being a scientist. And not all the initiatives are like that. I think many citizen scientists and citizen science initiatives don't have a, let's say, a activism nature, but some are, and I think they have this extra value compared to activists that do not, let's say, engage with science. And I think some problems need science more than others, of course. So for example, if we're talking about climate science, if we're talking about risk on nuclear radiation, definitely to be an environmental activist in this field, you need to know some science on it. And from knowing it to engage yourself in it, sometimes the steps are close. And I think this is particularly valuable. I would say we have the lack of being constantly exchanging with the US side on citizen science, because there is the, let's say, US-based Global Citizen Science Association, often in dialogue with the European Citizen Science Association. Let's say we've been exchanging some views in a way that we are able to compare to some extent. I would say what struck me most is that in the US, the level of institutional recognition of citizen science is probably higher, as there is a let's say let's say a longer history of really this cooperation between the scientists and the policymakers in a way that was recognized. For example, there is a Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act in the US that was promoted under the Obama administration. And this is a great legitimization. Then to what extent this is enforced is another question. And I think it's an important question. Yet it shows that institutions are more, let's say, ready to structurally cooperate and recognize a role to citizen science. In Europe, I think we're having steps on that direction. For example, recently the JRC released the staff working document on improving also the monitoring, environmental monitoring based on citizen science, citizen sensing, and so on. So things are moving there. But for example, on certain arena, like the recognition of citizen science in judicial scenarios, like in court, in Europe, there's barely no case of judicial uptake of citizen gathered evidence as qualified as citizen science, whereas in the US, things are moving, and there's also literature on that. So I would say on the European side, we need to also gather more lawyers into the domain, because I know many lawyers working on it on the US side and not really on the European side. Let's say the methods are quite subjective, in the sense that I wouldn't say there are methods for studying citizen science as a block and as a toolbox, but I can say what I found useful and some researchers around me find useful. I think it's a good combination between really theoretical review, because there are many valuable studies on citizen science and sensing. So whoever is interested in the field but hasn't like really grasped it, really you can start from the work of, I see Muki in the call, Muki as well, Muki Hatley, and what they're doing at UCL, many ongoing projects that are, let's say, promoting a clear understanding of what is citizen science in various domains, from the environmental sciences to health, to risk, and so on. So really start with a sort of landscaping of the field, and it's easier because it's mostly everything is open access. So you as a normal citizen, you should also be able to, for example, surf the European Citizen Science Association blog and have some information from there. After that, I would say for those scientists that want to dive more into that beyond the sort of literature analysis, on-site, otherwise online, really shadowing, it was quite important, because to understand how a citizen sensing initiative works, for example, I spent quite some time in Eindhoven following what the citizen scientists there were doing with air quality. I really wanted to understand from where they start and where they arrive. And I think this is possible only if you observe them day by day. And I think it's also important to be connected with institutions that are playing an important role in citizen science. For example, for me was the Joint Research Center, where I could be a visitor, and being inside, you can also understand a lot about their regulatory processes, the legal debate, the policy dimension. And lastly, I think complementing this with more quantitative analysis is also difficult but important, because by now citizen science is really scaling up, and the number of projects that you can explore are several. So for example, this Citizen Science for Policy database by the JRC has more than 500 cases and is an ongoing repository. So there is also a lot of potential to run quantitative analysis, or as I did in my project, qualitative comparative analysis that is basically a half-way solution between quantitative and qualitative, but also needs some, let's say, expertise to run it. So I really welcome, let's say, a combination of both. And I would say, I think out there's a lot going on that goes on both directions. So I'm pretty confident that the number of examples in that direction will only grow. In theory, I'm quite confident that the sole act of monitoring put a certain pressure on the actors that are engaged in the environmental wrongdoing, for example. So the idea that there is a watchful citizen that is, for example, every day going around my power plant with their air quality sensor, radiation sensor, puts some pressure. And I have to say, I experienced that in every place I've been. Like really the local actors couldn't ignore these people going around taking samples and so on. They even pushed themselves to worse than ignoring them, but they really couldn't ignore them. So it's a pressure that is implicit, but is powerful. And from there to actually, let's say, demand an intervention, it's a work of, like, of course, daily push. Like we, with the Census Project, we are very much in contact with a group of fishermen in Texas. And just after day by day, across years of monitoring, they could bring the plastic Formosa Plastic Corporation. So it's a very, let's say, time-consuming activity, but really the daily monitoring put a pressure on the involved actors. And of course, I mean, the involved actors can be more powerful and can try to silence the citizen. But I think when the initiatives take some media attention and also governmental attention, it's really difficult to silence the citizen. So that's what my experience showed. Then those that are silenced, it happens, and the initiative just fades away. So not all civic sentinels manage to get this outcome. But I have to say that the daily commitment often brings good results.